Pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
So call the
Perfect time.
budget meeting to order, and I'll turn it over to our treasurer, Charles, to give his presentation.
Thanks, Mayor. You should have a few documents in front of you. One of which that I can speak to has this 5 columns on the front, PowerPoint, which we, very similar to last time. You have that in front of the first
Yes.
page. It's kind of, we met on the 29th, we presented the preliminary budget, got your comments, and also got feedback from the department heads. So this reflects, just about all of the feedback that we got. I think it was well received, and not every piece went in dollar for dollar, but essentially the numbers that you see in the far right-hand column, the preliminary budget, 15.6 million of appropriations. We had some pluses and minuses, but this is about the same position. We currently have not pierced the cap. This is still tax increase within the cap, which is basically 2.5, 2.6%. The state allows for some inflation adjustment and tax-based growth, but it's very little. So this
It's
is.
fair to say, though, that inflation went up more than 2.5%.
Absolutely. Actually, the inflation adjustment is, the cap is 2%.
Right.
They, on top of that, they give you a 2% inflation adjustment of the two, so it's very.
Right.
Yeah.
2%.
So that means 4%?
No, I mean,
No,
it's 2.5,
2.5.
yeah, and then you adjust that for the perceived change in your tax base. And ours is very, almost zero.
Okay.
So it's, the number itself is 2.6%. So what you see here, and the appropriated fund balance 965 is essentially, we had 974 at the last meeting. So some changes, not too many, and I'll talk about the changes since that's meeting on the next page, but essentially the same what we had before. So the next page where we have the expenditures against the last budget meeting, you can see in total, they went up $25,000. And the largest, the only significant one was we added 50,000 for the lease of the gas ball lot.
Yep.
Yeah.
52.
Right, so I know we haven't signed it yet, but in anticipation of that, we put in 50,000 of expense to pay for it,
And there'll be revenue against that.
which we have not put in,
Right.
because it's uncertain.
It's uncertain, yeah.
very uncertain. But to the extent we get any revenue, that's obviously upside to the improvements of these numbers. The other changes in the expenditures, there were a bunch of very small items. The largest one we found, we had duplicated some IT costs in Village Hall and the docks, so we took that out, but essentially the expenses in total are about the same as we had before. Okay. Then the next page is looking at the expenditures versus last year's budget by each of the major areas. So as I mentioned last time, our largest expenditure is people and the related costs and benefits, retirement, taxes. So we had increases, we had a couple increases in additional positions in the police department, the village clerk's office, and we have an open position in the garage. But we had pay increases, and a lot of those are contractual, and those are pretty significant. And we also have increasing employee benefit costs, which are going up close to 10% or more per year, very significant. And employee benefit includes LoSAP, includes retirement, includes medical debt. So aside from that, all the positive numbers on that page in the change column are really related to people and benefits. Transportation decreased 152. We had the street lighting project done this year. So that comes out of the budget, that was about $330,000. Offsetting that, we had increases in personnel costs. We have 50,000 for the parking lot, and we have a vehicle in for the DPW, for the highway department, $52,000. So that's the net decrease of 152. And then on the docks, also a large decrease year over year, and that's because we had the harbor boat in the budget this year. It's obviously taken out. That's offset by some increase in personnel costs. Any questions?
What's this big one, decrease in culture and recreation?
Oh, that's the docks.
That's the top.
The docks falls into that. Okay.
I'm gonna save questions till you're done with your presentation, if that's okay.
Yep.
The next page are the revenues changes from the last budget meeting. So the total revenues from February 29th increased about $38,000. The largest individual component, we put in budget the third officer to support the school district. And the mayor has negotiated successfully reimbursement for half of those costs. So that we're treating as a revenue within the general funds.
We haven't signed a deal with the school yet, but in principle, we sat down with Jeff Nichols and he agreed to the terms of that, so.
So that's good. I mean, if you get between now and when we finalize this, if you get any indication you're not gonna.
No, everything's been positive.
Okay. Then let me jump down, building department plus 50,000. So the building department, we confirmed that we were a little bit too conservative. We had budgeted originally 450,000 this year. Right now, our revenue earned after 9 months, the fiscal year, is over 600,000. And last year, we ended up over 800,000. So, you know, to kind of help our budget this year, we bumped that up to 500, still, I believe, conservative, but certainly well within reason. And then you notice fire and ambulance revenues going down. This is predominantly the revenue they earn from servicing the other districts around us. So what's happened here is two things. It's, we look at our total costs of running those departments. And then we spread it over the towns that we serve by the assessed valuations and the relative, you know, if you look at the total, what each one is a percentage of the total. And what's happened, we just got, beginning of March, the new tentative assessed valuations, and Sag Harbor's valuation increased much higher rate than the other towns. So for example, Sag Harbor's assessed valuation increased 32% year over year. The other towns were more in the range of, you know, mid-teens to mid-20s. So as a result, you know, everybody else's percentage as a group went down, and that's the basis that we allocate our costs to. So we are basically retaining more cost based on this formula, the formula that we've always used on the state.
And that's because our expenses are more than,
No,
say,
just, the biggest factor is the relative assessed values of the towns. Sag Harbor's went up faster, became a bigger portion of the total.
If,
That's
property value.
yeah, and if anything, it might be the increased revenues that came through the building department result in a increased valuation of Sag Harbor property,
So the whole.
decreased allocation of
A
costs.
virtuous cycle.
Yes, that's one way of looking at it.
We used
Ouch.
to name
So
Stampin' on Southampton, Southampton.
North Haven, North Haven.
Yeah, so we send out fire and ambulance contracts to North Haven, the town of Southampton, and the town of East Hampton. And these numbers that you're talking about is spread out over those three
Correct.
municipalities as far as what they contract for us, for fire and ambulance services.
Noyak, yeah. Noyak, Big Point, North Haven.
I'm curious if, because also we had, in the previous contracts, that the fire boat was accounted for in those contracts.
So, yes, but,
Right,
so that comes out, right? So it also, you're spreading your
that
costs.
affects it also.
That, yes, but we also kept the budget the same because we increased the reserves.
Right, we just
For-
took that money and put it into their reserves for
Yeah.
the fire trucks.
Correct. And also their personnel expenses.
Right.
So in the case of the fire department, our costs stayed the same year on year. In the case of the ambulance group, their costs go up. So when you look at the numbers here.
Because of the
versus-
paid personnel, is that because of the paid personnel that we have and the benefits and?
Yeah, that's the biggest factor for increasing costs. And you kind of see, if you look, so that's versus the last budget. Since then, we got these new valuations. If you turn the page, I'm comparing against last year. And if you look at fire and ambulance, fire, our revenue is going down because of this assessed valuation factor I discussed.
Mhm.
But the ambulance is going up because yes, they get less money on an allocated basis, but their costs went up higher. Fire department costs stayed basically the same. So we just got to allocate less, so the same amount. The ambulance costs went up, and even though we were allocating less percentage, the costs were higher. So you can see the ambulance revenue is actually higher than last year. That makes sense.
Mhm.
So it's really kind of, the factors are our costs, and then sharing factors.
It's this $100 increase for the police department. Round it,
Feel that, yes.
right? Sorry, that all,
It's okay, it's okay. Let's keep going.
So,
We can all chip in 20.
badge polish.
On the page, the revenues compared to the last budget, just the other items, the PAC was 226,000, that's 2.56% increase at CAP. The village hall revenues, that's the school, police officer funding, from the school district. The harbor and docks, our revenue is less than last year. I think at the last meeting, we discussed certain portions of the dock are not going to be usable because at the end.
Oh, right, the north of, Long North, yeah.
Right, but
That's a-
generally I think we're being a little conservative there.
What portion aren't usable?
It's the end of Long Wharf.
The end of Long Wharf.
Yeah.
Yep, so we're not
It's
gonna,
never supposed to be in there anyway. Isn't it?
Let's keep going.
Keep going.
So. Harbor, do we expect less revenue? Hopefully not, but again, it's weather dependent and this is.
Exactly.
So we're a little conservative there. The building department, we just increased by this 10,000, as I discussed before.
That's personnel.
No, this is revenue, so this is,
No, I mean,
we're just. Increasing more. And then state and federal, this is the support of the police department in Suffolk County was increased this year. So we're increasing our budget for that, and there's just a bunch of other support. Okay,
Mhm.
so the next page, there's really two things going on here. On the left-hand side, I did a little financial projection based on the current condition. So what you see there is the column on the left is our proposed budget with our appropriations. And I broke out operating appropriations from capital budget that exists within our budget. That's the 390. And the 15,606 is the total from the first page. And then we're funding that with tax revenues, our other local revenues, the docks and the ambulance and the fire. But we're using 965 fund balance to balance out. We have to balance out our budget. So I said, okay, if we continue on this path, we increase our operating expenses by 4% a year. And honestly, they've been more than 4%. But if we say, all right, we're gonna have some restraint and we're gonna limit it to 4% increases. Keep capital budgeting the same. And if the revenues only increase for taxes or the docks and the others, are fairly fixed in terms of what we can expect, what would our appropriation of fund balance be? What this shows is this year we're at 965 for using reserves, unrestricted reserves. That would increase by about 400,000 to 1.3 million next year.
Mhm.
And 400,000. So the path is significant increase. I mentioned last time, we have unrestricted reserves of about $11 million.
Right.
But we do have close to 4 million of debts. If you say we have net reserves of 7 million, you could see over the next 3 years, nothing changes. We'll use close to 5 million of that.
And we're talking about operating costs going up, not,
Operating costs increasing faster than.
not the, right. Not not the capital part of the budget,
No,
but
no,
the
I'm
part
talking
that we really have limited control over, which is insurance costs.
Yep.
Fuel costs.
I would
No,
say, and
it's-
personnel. So of our $15 million personnel, all in personnel costs are 10. So, and again, it's salaries, and a lot of those are based on contracts that are negotiated, so once you locked in. There's only so many that you can have.
Health insurance.
Right.
Health insurance, the LoSAP, the retirement. So.
Right.
So. you
So
know,
it's,
that-
it's not necessarily something, we just have to be aware how it's gonna impact.
Future.
Yeah.
Well, in the present through the future, it's eating away our reserves
Yes,
and rather quickly. It's not,
Yeah.
we're not building reserves, we're eating reserves under this draft of the
Right.
budget.
right,
This is.
with these assumptions.
Unrestricted reserves.
Yep.
Okay. Let's just put that on the side for the moment. On the right-hand part of this page, and I'm sorry for the small print is, we do have a fair amount of capital or restricted reserves. And these are all set up for specific purposes, but you can see, right now, the first column, got about $3.4 million on the balance sheet of reserves. And then on our budget, and this has been consistent year in and year out, we're adding 390,000. So, you know, and we spend quite a bit of that, right? You make resolutions to use those monies. But right now, we're projecting, you know, at the end of next year, to have about 3.8 million of available reserves, everything from major equipment. The 21st Century Reserve is an infrastructure reserve, and that one's funded by the paid parking. So I did look up after our discussion this afternoon, even though the balance is 15,000, we put in this past year, we put in about 100,000 from parking and interest on those funds.
Mhm.
And I think in January or February, we had a resolution allocating 109,000 of that to projects around the village. So the fund, even though it's a low balance, it's one that builds up and we've been using on a concurrent basis. So these monies are available for the purposes that are indicated here. You know, certainly some of them are a little vague, major equipment, capital reserves. If we were to use them, we'd have to go back and look at what the original stated purpose was. It's also my understanding if there's money there that you want to use for a different purpose, that you could, you know, pass a resolution to reallocate it to something else.
And where is this money sitting right now?
Well, so it's on the balance sheet, so you have, basically, you have cash and you have a reserve. That makes sense.
Okay.
And I think
That's it, right?
So
that's my.
I have a
okay,
a
so
question.
that's it for the general fund. I want to talk about the sewer fund. I want you want to stop first.
I'll come
Let's
back
do questions.
Yeah,
at the end. If
You
you
wanna
want.
go to the sewer fund now? Let's do questions on this, because then the sewer fund is a whole different.
I
set of
agree, I would
numbers.
agree with that.
So that we have this fresh.
So any questions on the budget up to now?
Up to now? Okay, then we'll start with this and I'll work my way back. So I'm trying to understand these dedicated reserve balances. We're proposing, but the cash flow coming in and out of those aren't reflected in this. This is a point in time, correct?
Yeah, and the only movement is the middle column is our budget has $390,000 of additional funding. So
Yeah.
it's beginning of the year plus 390. If we didn't spend it, we'd have.
If we don't spend any, we have 3.8. That's, okay, that's a big piece, because I would think we should be spending some of
And we
these.
have.
Yes, and like, for example, sidewalks, transportation,
Yeah, drainage.
yep. So my first concern is that, you know, do we have a sense of things that we've already looked at, things we're planning to do, where we plan to spend against these reserves already? And what might that do to the end balance at the end of the fiscal year? And if the answer is no, that's okay. I would just want us to look at that.
I had discussed a few projects with Charles that, you know, we're looking at doing. One of which was the test bores up at the property on the turnpike, where we intend to move the DPW. That was one of them. Drainage issues
Mhm.
that we need to address.
And even things like, you know, we ran into over the last
Traffic study,
traffic.
environmental study.
Well, those studies I think are in different buckets. Is that correct?
So we do have money set
This is
aside
admin.
for RFPs.
But not for the actual work that comes out of the RFPs. And so
Right,
this would be the
right.
work that comes out of the
Yep.
RFPs potentially. And so that's one thing. The other is, you know, in past years, when we had an issue with a fire truck, and we hadn't adequately built a reserve, am I remembering this right, just in the last year or two? I just want to make sure that we're making sure that we're allocating appropriate reserves for all of our heavy major equipment,
Well,
so that when they come
do you want to
due.
answer this? You want me to answer about the fire? I can answer you about the fire department. There was a year, and I hate to say this term, when I was chief, that we had to replace 3 vehicles. We had we added a fire police vehicle. We added a Class A pumper, and we replaced a rescue truck. So with those 3 vehicles coming into service, we actually financed that, and I believe we're close to the end of that. The payments have greatly reduced. And at the end of it, I believe it's 26 that it comes off the books, or. So those are already allocated for. Right now, you have $738,000 in fire truck reserve.
Okay.
And I believe the next fire truck up to be taken out of service or replaced is 715.
That's the ladder.
No, that's a pumper. We have rescue tools on it. It has a lot of 5-inch hose on it. Because we have a major incident.
And you think that reserve's adequate for?
I think it's close. It's very
Okay.
close.
Which is
With the
great.
cost of fire trucks going
That's
up.
good
But
to
it will
hear.
clean it out.
Because
It would
that's,
pretty much zero it out.
you know, 3-4 years ago, the cost of financing was much cheaper than it would be today.
Mm-hmm.
So I think it's more important now that we establish reserves where needed. I guess my question would be, for the DPW, do we have adequate reserves? The same kind of thing that's been done for the fire department for future expenditures, 2, 3, or 5 years down the road. Are we reserving appropriate levels for replacement of heavy equipment, whether it's sweepers, dump trucks, whatever you're using, and will continue to use?
How it was explained to me is that they don't have to be, I brought this up at the last meeting about vehicle reserves for the police and the DPW. What I was told is this major equipment reserve, which is 320, will be 323,000, would be for major, can be used for a dump truck or.
But, so my question then would be, are we using any of that this year? So is that 323 really not 323?
I don't believe we're using,
This budget year we're talking
Are
about.
we buying anything this year?
No, because we have a police vehicle and a
That we've
DPW
accounted
truck
for.
in our operating expense
that
budget.
we've already
So-
accounted for.
Okay,
And we've always purchased those through the expense budget.
So we expect this reserve to be whole as we go into the next fiscal cycle.
Right.
okay. And then to your earlier comment about, we have other studies going on now that will require some capital investments. Maybe that's not a dedicated, maybe it's a general reserve.
Are any of them
Issue?
grant worthy?
I think they are, but even then they'd be reimbursable and.
Yeah,
wanna make
we'll
sure
still need
Yeah.
the facility.
So I think anything we try to do on the capital side going forward, we're gonna try to make it financially self-sustainable. But I think we plan for the worst and then work to, defray any cost of the taxpayers through grant funding and other contributions and other revenue sources to mitigate cost to taxpayers, but plan for the cost.
So I hear you and I understand, but as I started on this page by saying, we're already using almost $1 million of our unrestricted reserves.
Right.
And any further additions to the budget without other cuts would kick that high. Last year, we were about 650, so we almost increased 50% to 30%.
And so it's from this conversation, it sounds to me like the dedicated reserves, the restricted reserves, we're pretty comfortable with. The unrestricted reserves we're eating up, and that concerns me, and I'd like
It
to.
concerns me too,
Yeah,
because
Well,
it's
the
not
fact-
sustainable.
It's
Yes.
it's unsustainable. We're gonna have to look at increasing revenue streams for the village. There's somehow, it's, I don't wanna say it's simple math, but if inflation and costs are going up and we're capped at 2.5%, right? We're either gonna pierce the cap and taxes are gonna go up, or we need to increase revenues to meet that or lessen that blow somewhat.
I
Or cut costs.
think
But
both.
where can you cut costs?
Yeah,
I think
Really?
we need to
We need to
look at piercing the cap and look for alternative revenue sources, but we can't plan for the alternative revenue sources until we secure them.
I mean, on this trajectory, how long would it be before there was no reserve?
If trends continue.
If trends continue, like,
Take 2 more years.
Yeah, probably two to three more years.
which is tomorrow.
Yes.
Yeah.
Exactly.
It gives you no time for recovery.
Yeah.
right?
No,
And
that's
when
the
you put it
thing,
in
yeah,
place,
we need
it
to,
takes time to.
and even the reserves, if we were to expand different programs that provide income to the village, they're finite as well, and you know, with like a year's worth of paid parking on Long Wharf is $100,000, which is wonderful. But it pales into insignificance when you compare it to the numbers we're dealing with there. And we could increase paid parking in the village, which we are considering. But even still, that's not gonna be, it'll help.
Right, it
Well,
helps.
and that would be a 1 year bump, right? You're gonna go up 100,000.
Yeah, and then there would be, we would have that revenue.
And
year on
we'll
year.
we'll continue to look for other revenue streams
We have
as
more
well,
work to do.
but we still have to look at
But-
increasing these
Yeah,
reserves.
if it's 9 to 1, like you're spending 9, but you're only getting 100, right? It's-
No, I think what you're saying is if you wanna know that you have a reserve for, build up a reserve, so you have something to say, here's my money to do X, Y, or Z.
Because we have X, Y, and Z coming down the road.
Yeah,
Yep.
I thought the reserves should, you know, I think it's core policy when your reserves are being used
To fund your
to
operating.
fund your
Operations.
operating costs.
And not
That- that
capital
only-
improvement.
Yeah,
If there's an unusual circumstance, an extraordinary event that happens sometimes, maybe once or twice, but not as an ongoing
Not as-
practice.
Yeah, so, and that's what we're doing now, we're using.
And this projection, but it's a really helpful projection to
Yes.
help us see
and
this.
if you use it 1 year, it's more than likely you'll need to use it the following year.
Well, that's-
Because last year we used it.
It's not a good habit.
Therefore, we didn't raise taxes enough to cover last year, and therefore we left our income short for this year, and it's sort of a.
And as you know, costs never go down, right?
Yeah.
Certainly, we're talking, again, most of our costs are personnel costs. And they just keep going up, even if you didn't give people raises, the benefits. and-
Insurance for sure.
And we only added a few people, but we're
We were,
expensive.
again, hold on, we were short a few people.
Yeah, no, I'm just
Like-
saying relative to the last
Right.
one. Yeah, but it's,
I also just want to address your comment that costs never go, I agree that costs typically don't go down. But one of the things we can do with prudent capital investment is mitigate future cost increases because replacing things, doing things on an O&M basis in the long run can be more costly on a day-to-day basis than prudently investing for the future. And so that's why eating up this reserve concerns me because I want to make sure we're financially capable to continue to prudently invest for the future.
Right, that we're
Right.
not running around putting out fire, so to speak.
Right.
Yes.
And we have the same issue, we'll find out shortly.
That's.
Well, but the reality of it is, you're talking about if we don't use the 965, that we're gonna have to raise taxes more than the 2.5%.
Yep.
yeah, you
So
could
I mean, yeah,
tax, if we doubled the tax rate to 5%, not the tax rate, you doubled the increase
Increase.
to 5%, that would only generate another $230,000.
Oh,
So it's not gonna wipe out this.
There may be something to said for we're not gonna solve this problem in this single cycle,
Yes.
but the trend is important. And
And-
I'm far more interested in bending the trend, so to speak, so that we can sort of push that line down so that we're on a path over the next number of years.
And to our earlier conversation, we're going to be looking at multiple ways to address this issue. One is alternative revenue sources. The other is increasing the tax level to help mitigate the eating up of this fund too. I think it's multiple things we have to look at to do to stop this from happening.
simultaneously.
Yeah. And not all of them will be definitive. A tax increase would be pretty definitive, but exploring other alternate revenue sources as well will help.
And to the extent, we're very good at getting money from other jurisdictions, right? We have some capacity to pay for some expenses in advance of reimbursement, not millions, but there's hundreds of thousands where we could get projects started if we knew the timing of money that's gonna come back. So that obviously helps too to get other people to talk problems.
Do you think any of your future income sort of building departments are on the low side? You said earlier, we're being very conservative.
Absolutely.
How conservative are we being? Is there some latitude there for?
Well, I think you know, if you go back to the very first page,
Right.
I said this last time, if you look at the three consecutive years on the left, we actually have, I'll call it profits, but our revenue exceeded our expenses, 1.6, 1.7, 700,000. Interesting that it decreased in those 3 years. And we had budgets where the budget had some fund balance appropriate. So our initial budget was conservative and we thought we'd have to eat into our fund balance. And it turned out for, you know, there were quite things that we didn't expect that happened. We didn't have to. You can see even so far this year, column all the way to the second from the right, we have a little bit more revenue, 400,000 more revenue than expenses. But as you know, aside from the docks, there's very little revenue coming in. And this is as of January, so February,
Right.
not too much, March, and then it starts to pick up towards the end of this fiscal year, so. So our history has been to
That 965 is not really, it's to
Yeah, I
meet it
think-
now, but it usually,
if
Right.
the docks, the building department do as they've done in the past, that could be, you know, 3, 4, 500,000
Right.
of additional revenue.
It's just whether it slows down or not,
Yeah.
and you can't
And then, of
predict.
course, there's no surprises on the expense side.
Right.
There's-
Are we keeping the dock rates the same this year? There's no increase in dock rates?
We can look at it for next, I mean, we're already done, because
Right.
we can certainly look
We had
at
an
it.
increase last year, right?
Right,
Yeah.
Last year was nowhere near the inflation this year.
I don't think we increased anything near the rate of inflation.
It should be.
We did with some salaries actually, but that was about it.
Are these unrestricted funds, where are the actual funds held? Are they interest bearing?
Yeah, most of them are money markets, either M&T or.
So I think we're gonna need a multi-source solution to this, so we might have to go around and chip away at this from a number of different pots, so to speak. And we can do a projection, which we haven't included in here, would be paid parking is going to increase.
Right.
So I'll do some work on that and maybe get that back to you, based on what we've had on Long Wharf. I think we have 2 scenarios to look at that we could increase that substantially, I think. And maybe as we're gonna need one more time on this before, that we can include that and see if we can chip away at this number a little bit. And if we have any other ideas in the meantime.
And then, well, I'm sorry, go
I
ahead.
was just gonna say, the big change in the building department, not this year, but the year prior, was how we, you'd assess what the total amount was.
Right.
And then they would true up at the end of the project, and that definitely was what caused a big bump up for us.
So one of the concerns I have is if I look at and I'm on the second to last page, no. Third to last page. Okay.
General fund.
Where we
financial
just were, yeah,
projections.
the general fund financial projections.
Yep.
Total capital budget line. Our total capital budget line is $390,000.
That just reflects funding of these reserves. In addition to that, the department budget, as I mentioned, the police department has a vehicle, DPW has a vehicle.
So that's this on the side.
Yeah, those are capped, but have always been funded by our operating expense. I just try to distinguish operating versus kind of reserves. But in addition to the vehicles, all the departments have spending budgets for equipment, smaller cars, individually smaller, but in the tens of thousands of dollars.
Right.
Fire.
And those are essentially, let me ask it this way. The capital expenditures that all the departments have in those budget items are, it sounds like you're saying, are funded through our annual revenue stream. They're not financed in any way. When we get to, for example, sewage treatment and other areas, we're going to be financing and amortizing those costs over 20, 30 years. I just want to point that out as another way for truly long-term assets. They shouldn't be hitting us on an annual basis in the budget. We should be funding those costs over time. So if it's a
You're talking
long,
about major infrastructure.
yes,
Right, okay.
because I'm thinking, one of the other things I'm thinking about now is stormwater
Mhm.
that we're going to be looking at as part of the studies we're doing.
Mhm.
I mean, these costs are going to be benefiting residents if, to the extent we get solutions that make sense.
Yeah, they'll benefit for 50, 60, 70, 100 years, so the people who have yet to be born need to be paying some of that, so if we bond that out.
And that's why for me, you know, having, and so that kind of a, currently not in our operating plan expenditure, I want to make sure we're starting to budget for, as opposed to eating the reserves that exist
Right.
there already.
Yeah. So yes, you know, really, the only one that I can say that definitively for is the sewer expansion project. But
I agree with you. That's the only one that's definitively for, and that's, I think we should deal with that separately
Yeah.
because there's grant funding associated with that, and we've already kind of thought through some of the financing for that. It's the ones that we know we want to work on and that are important to the community as well, that we don't have the budget set for yet in terms of a capital plan because we haven't seen
What the true cost is
studies.
gonna be, right?
Yeah, the studies of the solutions and what it would take to implement them. One other one I want, and this is a secondary, but the, you know, continuation of the railing, the safety railing underneath the bridge between Steinbeck
From
Park
Long Wharf
and
over, right.
Windmill Beach. We received the estimate for that. Do we, you know, I'd like to get that done this year as possible too. I'm assuming that's not in our budget. Is it?
It's not in the budget,
Yeah,
because we have a price, but we didn't put out an RFP for it or, yeah.
it's like 300,000, which was actually a relief because it was down from like 2 years ago during the height of the cost. It was up like 800,000. So, but still a
Had to do with
big,
the style of
Yeah.
fence too,
no, I mean, this is the higher,
the better one.
yeah, it came
It's
down
more the
dramatically.
pandemic being over and the
Yeah.
costs are fortunately less
So,
once.
so those kind of expenditures we see coming, we haven't put out the RFPs for, you know, that, stormwater studies, things like that. But these are valuable investments for the community.
Could they be financed over a longer period of time?
They can. They
As
can.
opposed to trying to come up with the 300, we need it, the community will benefit from it for decades to come.
Exactly.
As opposed to the community that exists here today,
Mhm.
having to pay for it all this year, that there's a way of.
Well,
And we're gonna have to do 8,
so an example of that is the street lighting program. We could have financed that over time, but we decided to pay for it all up front and reap the benefits
Mhm.
right away, which is part of our operating costs,
Yep.
to decrease our operating
Right.
costs.
And you can model those kinds of things to see, okay, net, it's probably better to pay for that upfront maybe, but.
Right, take savings.
Yeah, but something like, you know,
Railing,
Greater than
railing
the
is totally
interest.
different.
Yeah.
but other situations, you know.
when we
we're
go
gonna
to
wanna
do
use-
ADOC, which we should be doing 2 years ago.
But that's gonna have a revenue stream coming back that we can plan for too. But yes, that would be a long-term, you know,
Right.
capital project, you know, potentially outlay as well, not all in one year hitting the budget. So we have a number of these things that we see coming, even though the RFPs aren't out there. I want to make sure that we try to budget for in a way, and I'd rather, you know, not that all of it needs to hit the tax base, because we've got the possibility, you know, do a Monte Carlo risk assessment in your own mind of your conservative budgeting. Well, maybe you got a 50% chance of a few $100,000 of increase, a few $100,000 increase in taxes, a few 100,000 other revenue streams. Okay, we can maintain the reserves and we'll try it that way for a year to see if that, you know, covers the reserve without depleting the reserves going forward, like it looks like we're projecting. Does that make sense?
yeah,
We may have to do a little bit of everything,
Yeah.
you know?
Say no if you disagree.
Yeah,
This is what's before us, what we know, projects we know we're going to do, some projects or preparation for projects,
Right.
admin side that we're looking to.
that's,
So that's what's before us now. As far as these other things, other projects, a railing or other issues that might come up, could be an emergency if that's the situation. I mean, we can and cannot project. We have a number of $300,000 for the railing. But to take that out of this budget or to prepare for it now, I think it's a little
But I think-
premature.
I think it's prudent to pay for it now. If I
That
could.
should be addressed individually,
Right.
right?
Right.
And not as in a sense running.
Oh, the project should be approved individually, but we should have a fund available, a capital fund available, so that we're not so that we can make decisions as a board to say, okay, here's our prioritization, here's the money available, here's our prioritization of projects that we should try to implement in the next year as a
Mhm.
village.
And that fund should not be financed in any one year. This is a fund
Right.
that's available to us
Right.
to use over long term, so we can plan for infrastructure projects in the village and not always trying to pay for them out of cash flow. Because it doesn't really make sense. I mean, we could look at that number of $900,000 that we're looking at having transferred from the fund. If we can look at that and say, okay, well, paid parking might take that down to 700.
Mhm.
And then if we go back and look at the building department, then maybe we get down to 500. And then all of a sudden, we start, like, we'll need to dig deeper.
It's not as bad as we thought it was then.
That, you know, that maybe by looking at all the variables in here, that there might be a way of closing the gap. We also have the historic knowledge that we have usually outperformed. Now, we do that because we're being conservative. We've done
Right.
conservative.
Right.
We're
That
not
disappears.
gonna-
Yeah, right.
But I do think we need to, you know, it's a good exercise for us to do. We have a little bit of time to do it. And I think Ed's point of having a capital fund is the only way that we will successfully finance. And
But they're- right.
because the numbers are huge, like numbers, each one of these is, you know, each one of these projects represents like a fairly decent percentage of the annual budget
Sure.
of the village.
Well, yeah,
I mean, sewer project is more than the annual budget of the village, so it's, and I think it's a more sophisticated and a smarter way of
Yeah,
going.
but
So the capital, let me just ask a question. The capital reserve fund, which is at the bottom of that small detail that they have under the projection page, financial projections page, that's at 1.538, correct?
Yeah, will be.
It will be, all right?
Budget
And that those funds could be used for,
I believe there's some
Capital.
discretion, but we'd have to check the original resolution, but for major, whether it's,
a capital improvement.
yeah, long lasting capital.
Yeah.
So there is 1.5
there's some money
million.
there.
Like sewers were left to capitalize over 40 years, I understand, which is,
Mhm.
Wow.
which makes the borrowing.
So there is money there for a project here or there.
This building,
Yeah,
for instance, as an example, that would be a separate enterprise, right? We wouldn't try to figure that in now.
We'd figure that out separately and structure that
Yeah,
separately,
that's
but things like the railing is a capital investment that will create no new revenue stream.
no,
No, it is a liability.
Which is why we, yes,
Need to do it
That's why it's
sooner
not-
rather than later.
exactly, that's why it's all shut down.
Right.
Is that, right? Kid?
Although
yeah,
it looks like you put a camera up there, thank you, I think. Did you?
is it working?
So those kinds of things would theoretically hit this capital reserve. Is this capital reserve line here on the bottom? Does it have any projects that will built into it already? Or is it just assumed that will not be touched?
Right now, it says nothing, that's why it's there, because if we decide to pick a project here or there that we can afford, or that we feel is,
We want to prioritize.
Right,
Yeah.
is the A or B coming in here at 5 o'clock?
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay, so we
we
probably
need to get to the sewer.
get to the sewer.
Yep,
Oh, there's one truck that's coming up. Is that would have to cover it?
That was 700 and,
It's already.
you're talking about
It's
the
in
fire
there.
truck?
Yeah.
Yeah, it's 738,000 now. I mean, the cost of fire trucks is going up, so they pretty much like that out.
By that, the first fire truck is starting at zero.
Right.
Fund, right, and we're putting in, this is fairly sizable, $200,000 a year, so you can build it with.
Pretty good. And get another save the boat
okay, sewer.
fundraiser.
Sure.
Okay, sewer fund, you should see where again, our operating expenses in the budget, 896,000, 75,000 increase over last year. And our operating principle is that we're gonna fund our operating expenses with revenues.
Well,
Our revenue, 900,000 exceeds that. Ideally, the revenues would also fund your reserves. That's just what we were talking about.
Yeah,
But you'll see on the next page, we're increasing our rates, proposing to increase our rates fairly significantly, just to cover our operating
yeah,
expenses.
but I think it has to be recognized that we're starting from a very low base, like
Mhm.
percentage wise. There was a period of the sewer plant for 4 or 5 years, when inflation was very low. And we really didn't increase anything. Last year was the first year we increased the sewer rent, I think.
Yeah, so if you go to the next page, there's.
What is it?
History. the sewer fund revenue, is the
Sewer
whole
fund
history
revenue.
of the rates.
Yeah.
The usage on the left. You can see the usage was increased, the rate increased every year.
Mhm.
This year, we're proposing 909, which is a 6.9% increase.
Yeah,
And sewer rents, really, up until 2023, we're not changing.
We're not changed at all, so and we have an aging infrastructure, and one of the things about the storage, you can get a call right now, we have a $50,000 pump needs to be replaced, there's something going on. So not using our reserves, I get growing very uncomfortable with the idea of using reserves to fund our day-to-day.
Mhm.
And so we have increased, and for a homeowner, for a private hookup, even though it's a 10% increase on the residential, it's from $250 to $275.
right, yeah.
It's
Nothing.
it's a $25 increase, so if you get, in this situation, normally I hate to get beyond the percents, but I think it's really important here.
No,
Yeah, dollars are always important to have context.
Yes,
Yeah.
exactly.
$22 per month.
100% increase of $5 of the
And
net.
then we have the same for the commercial, it goes from 1,500 to 16, but it stayed at 1,250. If I went back to 2012 and ran an inflation curve out, I'd like to see where.
It's a good
maybe
deal.
You could do that for us for the next meeting. Or if you just did a straight inflation curve from 2012, so that we can have a apples to apples
It's,
comparison.
the real rate is lower than.
Yeah, we're lower than Nassau County, I think we're lower than, there was a couple like Tim pulled out of comparisons.
And again, your costs for operating are,
Oh,
they're out of
yeah.
your control. I mean, the cost to haul away sludge
Sludge hauling has,
has
we're,
increased.
right,
we're adding 37, that's gone up
Right.
$37,000.
$37,000. Basically went up more than, about a third.
About a third. And
well, because they have to go further,
we have no control over that, with fewer and fewer places are accepting it.
yeah, that's the problem.
So I'm happy to sit with anybody if we have any issues with the budget and go through it line by line. There's really nothing, you and I have gone through it with a fine tooth comb. There's no vehicles in there. It's pretty much all operating expenses. It's polymers, chemicals, power. If we get solar panels on the roof, we'll make, it's not even, we had a look at that, and yes, would it help? Would it be more environmentally friendly? Yeah. It's hardly gonna make it.
Payback is totally marginal.
Yeah.
In terms of the life of it.
Yeah.
But at some point, that sewage treatment plant will need a significant upgrade.
Yes,
And we're not reserving for that.
no,
So,
Mm.
and so that's a concern as well. I mean, so this, we are charging less than the long-term cost of service of operating, maintaining that sewer
Yeah.
plant.
Yeah, that's a really good point.
so we're trying to turn this ship around a little bit.
Yeah.
Okay.
We're running out of time here. We're getting
Yeah.
kicked out, fortunately.
I don't think there's anybody on the sewer budget.
That's all right.
Our final meeting before we present it to the public for approval is in 2 weeks.
Yep.
So I'll circle back with each of you to make sure we accomplish what we need to the next meeting.
Thank
Okay.
you.
Thank you, Charles.
Thank you very
Thanks,
much.
Joe.
Thanks, everybody.
Yeah,
And if you could run out the
Yeah.
the inflation, I'd love to see that.
Motion to adjourn,
So moved.
second,
Second.
all in favor?
Aye.
Motion, carried, meeting adjourned.
Do you want to come into your office now?
Sure.
Put it back.
Right,
You wanna